Welcome to Lives Beneath History. Abibaal is a Phoenician merchant who trusts silver more than sentiment and knows the weight of damp boots on a hostile shore. In the early Iron Age Mediterranean, when Tyre's ships stitched together distant coasts through trade and risk, he sails west to the Iberian mines that sustain his fortune. He hates the sea's touch, yet has built his life upon it. This is his story. Abibaal hated getting wet. That was an inconvenience in his line of work, which required him to spend much of his time on the decks of rain-lashed ships or sloshing through the surf as he stepped onto yet another beach in search of profits. He had done so dozens of times over his years, plying the sea lanes of the Mediterranean. Ever since his first short hop up the coast from Tyre to Sidon when he was a boy, his father, Abibaal, recalled, had acquired a small farm in the hills inland from the coast of Phoenicia. The old man said it was perfect for vines, and that it would produce the finest wine this side of Judea. He was wrong about that. The wine had been terrible, at least to Abibaal's taste, so bad that nobody in Tyre would pay a sliver of silver for a jar of it. Then his father had an idea. They would sell the wine in Egypt, using a friend's ship to transport the ceramic storage containers from Tyre to the great river's delta. His only son, not yet 12 years old, would go with the cargo as surety. That first trip away from home terrified and electrified Abibaal at the same time. The rolling sea during a sudden summer storm, the strange reed boats in the Egyptian harbor, the thrill of success when he had haggled with the buyer for a better price and fine linen, the way his head had spun from the strong wine he drank to celebrate, far better than the stuff he had just sold. From that trip onward, Abibaal knew that his future would be at sea. Yet, despite all those trips in the intervening decades, all his sojourns to Cyprus and Nubia and Sardinia and Iberia, he still could not stand getting wet. He hated the moldy smell of damp clothing and how cold his feet got. He hated the way his iron dagger rusted in its sheath after exposure to the damp sea air. He hated slipping on the sodden, worn smooth deck of an old trading ship when it rolled with the waves. He loved looking at the sea from a distance and the smell of clean, salty air on the breeze, but the actual water had never appealed to him. He could not even swim. Abibaal sighed as the ship's lookout called out their destination, just now coming into view ahead of them. A thin, stony strip of shingle hemmed in by cliffs on both sides, as difficult a landing spot as any he had used in recent years. The local chieftain, however, ran a fantastically productive silver mine in the Iberian hills, and was too fond of ivory ornaments and gold jewelry for his own good. That was an opportunity Abibaal could not pass up, no matter how much he dreaded the pitching boat ride through the surf and the undignified splashing that followed. The merchant and the Iberian chieftain had been doing business for 25 years. He had once married the chieftain's daughter, a strong-willed girl who had not survived the birth of their son. The boy was far to the east now, in Cyprus, but his grandfather and father still honored the deals they had made. For a moment, a pang of sadness overcame Abibaal. He thought of that day so long ago, when he had come to the same beach for the first time to meet the Iberian chieftain. He remembered the smirk on the face of the chieftain's daughter, the girl who would soon become his wife, and how confused he had been. Abibaal usually tried not to dwell on the past, but today he allowed himself to feel the old hurt. The wind shifted as they approached the headland, carrying with it the dry scent of crushed herbs from the cliffs above. The sea here was colder than in the Levant, and heavier. It did not lift and fall in the long, steady rhythm he knew from home. It struck from odd angles, reflecting off rock faces and curling back upon itself. He had chosen this season carefully. Too early in the year, and the storms from the Western Ocean would drive a vessel against the rocks. Too late, and rival traders might already be in the chieftain's hall, offering inferior goods at lower weight. Timing mattered more than boldness. The hull creaked as the steersmen adjusted their angle. The ship was broad-bellied and slow, built in the Phoenician fashion with high sides to keep cargo dry. Bundles of ivory tusks lay lashed amidships, wrapped in oiled cloth. Carved cedar chests held worked gold from workshops in Tyre, fine chains and rings hammered thin and precise. There were bolts of dyed wool, deep purple and crimson, though he knew the Iberians preferred bright metal to cloth. At the stern, Sealed jars of oil and wine were secured with rope netting. He had learned long ago to diversify a cargo. Mines could flood. Chieftains could die. A feast could fail to impress. A trader who carried only one thing invited ruin. Spray struck his face as the boat dipped. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, annoyed at the sting in his eyes. Around him, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. Most were men from Tyre and Sidon, though 2 had joined in Sardinia and 1 in Gadar. He trusted none of them completely, but he trusted their need for pay. They had signed on for a share of profit, not merely a fixed wage. That arrangement kept them watchful. If the cargo sold well, they would all return home wealthier. If it did not, they would grumble, but they would still have eaten. He had set the shares himself before departure, calculating what he could afford to lose and what he must gain. He did not think in terms of hope. He thought in weights and measures. The lookout called again. The beach was clearer now. He could see figures waiting above the shingle, small against the cliffs. Spears glinted in the light. He counted them without appearing to do so. A dozen, perhaps more, behind the rocks. That was normal. The chieftain did not send miners to greet a ship. He sent warriors. Abibaal checked the leather cord that secured his dagger. The blade would need oil again after this landing. He resented that. Rust crept in, even when he was careful. He preferred bronze for its resistance, but iron had become cheaper and easier to replace. Practicality won over preference. The helmsman shouted for the oars to be shipped. The sail was lowered halfway. They would not risk running aground under full cloth. 2 sailors moved forward with poles to fend off rock if necessary. The ship's hull shuddered as a swell lifted them and then dropped them toward the shallows. Abibaal steadied himself against a beam. He calculated the distance. Another few lengths. They would not bring the vessel fully ashore. Instead, they would anchor in the lee of a rocky outcrop and ferry goods by smaller boat. He disliked the smaller boat even more than the large one. It rode low and filled quickly with water. When the anchor stone splashed down and the rope went taut, he felt a measure of relief. The worst of the open water was behind them. Now came the surf. He oversaw the lowering of the skiff himself. Ivory first, he decided. It was lighter than gold by volume and made an impression. Gold could follow under closer guard. He stepped into the skiff last, boots already damp from spray. The cold water seeped through the seams. He set his jaw. The rowers pushed off, timing their strokes between waves. As they neared the beach, he could hear the crunch of pebbles under the retreating tide. A breaker struck them broadside. Water sloshed in, soaking his lower tunic. He cursed under his breath, but kept his balance. When the keel scraped stone, he stepped over the side into knee-deep surf. The shock of cold traveled up his legs. He hated this part. It felt undignified, like a novice. He forced himself forward, boots grinding against a shifting shingle. 2 Iberian warriors approached, their hair bound with leather strips, shields slung across their backs. He recognized neither, but that meant little. 25 years was enough time for boys to become men and men to vanish. He raised his hand in greeting, palm outward, the gesture he had used for decades. One of them returned it after a pause. That was sufficient. He supervised the unloading in silence. Each tusk was carried high to avoid wetting. He instructed his men sharply when one stumbled. Moisture warped ivory. He would not have it cracked before presentation. When the first load was secure above the high-water mark, he allowed himself to look up the slope. At the crest stood the chieftain. The man was older now, beard streaked with white, shoulders broader than Abibaal remembered. He leaned on a spear, but did not seem frail. Their eyes met across the distance. Abibaal felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He had once stood on this same beach as a younger man, uncertain of his footing in more ways than one. He had come then not only with goods, but with ambition. The chieftain had tested him with hard questions about weight and purity. His daughter had watched from behind her father, expression unreadable. He remembered the smirk clearly now. It had not been mockery, he later decided. It had been assessment. She had weighed him as her father had. When Abibaal climbed the slope this time, he did so steadily, ignoring the damp fabric clinging to his legs. The chieftain extended his forearm. Abibaal grasped it firmly. Their grips were practiced. You return. the chieftain said in a rough accent shaped by years of trade. "As long as silver comes from your hills," Abibaal replied evenly, "I will find my way here." The chieftain's mouth curved slightly. There was no mention of the daughter. There never was. They conducted their business in the hall above the cliffs, as they always had. The structure had grown over the years, beams thicker, walls reinforced with stone at the base. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and animal hides. Silver ingots lay stacked on a low table, dull and heavy. Abibaal approached them with measured steps. He picked one up, testing its weight in his palm. He examined the surface for impurities. He had learned to look for discoloration that suggested careless smelting. The chieftain watched without comment. Trust had been built, but it was always accompanied by verification. He presented the ivory first. The tusks drew murmurs from the warriors lining the walls. The chieftain stepped forward to run his hand along one smooth curve. Abibaal explained their origin briefly, omitting exact locations. It was enough to say they had come from far to the south. He laid out a gold necklace next, its links fine and uniform. He had chosen pieces that displayed craftsmanship rather than sheer weight. A chieftain valued reputation as much as adornment. Negotiation followed. It was deliberate, not heated. The chieftain argued for a lower rate, citing last winter's storms that had damaged a mine entrance. Abibaal countered by noting the visible increase in ingot stacks. He did not accuse, he observed. They settled on a measure that favored Abibaal slightly. He allowed that advantage to stand without pressing further. Stability over years mattered more than squeezing every grain of profit from a single exchange. As servants brought watered wine, Abibaal found his thoughts drifting to the past again. He remembered sitting in this hall beside the chieftain's daughter after their marriage, listening to talk of shipments and alliances. She had spoken little in public, but had been direct in private. She had told him plainly that if he failed to honor her father's terms, she would return to this hall without him. He had respected that clarity. When she died in childbirth, he had been in Sardinia securing tin. The message had reached him weeks later. He had calculated the days it would take to sail back and realized he would not see her alive. He had completed his trade before turning east. Practicality had guided him then as well, though the memory still tightened his throat. The child had survived, a son. He had left the boy in Cyprus under the care of a trusted associate, where Greek tutors could teach letters and numbers. Iberia was no place for an infant, nor was the deck of a ship. He wondered now what kind of man the boy was becoming. The chieftain's voice drew him back. "You will stay 3 days," the older man said. It was both invitation and expectation. Abibaal inclined his head. He would remain long enough to oversee the weighing of silver and the loading of goods, but not so long that other ports were neglected. Time lost here could cost him in Tyre or Carthage. That evening, as he lay on a pallet in a side chamber of the hall, he listened to the wind outside. It carried the distant roar of surf against stone. His boots were set near the hearth to dry, though he knew they would still smell faintly of brine. He flexed his feet, feeling the ache from the cold landing. He thought about risk. Each voyage required it. Storms, reefs, pirates, treachery, disease. Yet the greater risk, in his view, was stagnation. A man who remained inland among failed vines would never accumulate enough to secure his line. His father had clung to soil and suffered for it. Abibaal had chosen movement. Even if he disliked the water, he accepted its necessity. On the second day, he rode with a small escort to view the mine. The path wound through dry hills, dotted with scrub. He observed the workers from a distance, men emerging from shafts blackened with soot. He studied the carts, the smelting pits, the flow of ore to furnace. Productivity seemed steady. He asked measured questions about output and labor. The chieftain answered without defensiveness. This was inspection, not accusation. Abibaal needed assurance that silver would continue to flow. Without it, future voyages would need rerouting. When he returned to the beach on the third day, the weather had turned again. Clouds pressed low over the sea. His ship rocked at anchor. He felt the familiar reluctance settle in his stomach. Another wet crossing lay ahead. As his men carried ingots down the slope, he supervised closely, ensuring each was marked and tallied. Loss could occur at any stage, during loading, during transit, even in Tyre's warehouses. He relied on written records and memory, both. He had trained himself to recall weights and faces with equal precision. When at last he stepped once more into the skiff, he felt the cold water seep into his boots as before. He did not curse this time. He simply braced himself and moved forward. The chieftain stood above, watching. There was no gesture of farewell beyond a raised hand. That was enough. As the skiff pulled away and the larger ship came closer, Abibaal allowed himself one final glance at the thin strip of shingle between cliffs. He remembered a younger version of himself climbing that slope with ambition and uncertainty. He remembered a woman's assessing smirk and the brief years that followed. He felt the old hurt again, but it did not overwhelm him. It settled into place among other facts of his life, like the weight of silver, the cost of ivory, the certainty of wet boots. He climbed aboard the ship and gave the order to raise sail. The wind caught the cloth. The hull turned eastward. He stood at the stern as the coastline diminished, salt drying on his skin. He still hated getting wet. He suspected he always would. But as the ship found its rhythm and the silver lay secured below deck, he felt the steady satisfaction that had guided him since boyhood. The sea was unpleasant, unpredictable, and cold. It was also the path by which he had built his name and secured his family's future. That balance, like every negotiation he conducted, was one he had chosen deliberately. Abibaal will not be remembered in royal inscriptions or carved upon temple walls. His name will travel only as far as the ledgers he kept and the silver he weighed with steady hands. Yet the routes he sailed and the bargains he forged bound distant shores more tightly than any decree. While kings measured power in conquests, men like him measured it in cargo holds and quiet agreements sealed beside cold surf. History speaks loudly of empires, but it is carried quietly by those who endure the salt and the uncertainty. In the rhythm of oars and the careful tally of ingots, his life left its mark. Thank you for listening to Lives Beneath History.